Ladies and gentlemen, the first keynote is the one that saves people from emotional self-destruction, because it explains the most confusing moment of all. When you finally stop chasing, the avoidant doesn't always collapse. Many of them feel relief first. And if you don't understand that, you will misread their calm as proof you meant nothing. You will panic, and you will chase again at the exact moment your power was starting to work. Let's be honest about what it feels like on your side. You stop texting. You stop explaining. You stop asking for closure. You stop trying to be understood. You finally decide, "Oh, I'm done." And a part of you expects some immediate response from them. A message, a regret, a sudden softness. You expect the avoidant to feel the loss the way you feel the loss. But avoidant nervous systems don't process loss the same way anxious nervous systems do. Anxious attachment reaches for closeness to regulate. Avoidant attachment reaches for distance to regulate. So when you remove yourself, your body feels pain because your regulator is gone. Their body feels relief because their trigger is gone. That is not romance. That is physiology. And this is where the audience's mind snaps open, because many people have been living with a silent belief. If I stop chasing, they'll finally miss me. But stage 1 shows why that doesn't happen immediately. When you stop chasing, the pressure drops, the conflict drops, the emotional demand drops, the responsibility they felt drops, the fear of being exposed drops, and suddenly they can breathe. So they may seem calm, they may seem cold, they may even look happier, they may post more, they may socialize, they may act unbothered, and you interpret that as, "I was nothing." But ladies and gentlemen, that interpretation is poison, because stage 1 is not a measure of your value. It is a measure of their coping style. Relief is the avoidant's first emotion because withdrawal is their primary regulation strategy. Think about it. If closeness triggers them, distance soothes them. So the moment you stop chasing, their nervous system gets what it wanted. Space without emotional negotiation. That feels good, that feels safe, that feels like control. And here is the most important detail: relief is often temporary. Relief is not healing. Relief is deactivation. Deactivation is emotional numbing used to avoid discomfort. It's the internal shutdown that says, "I'm fine," while the deeper feelings are simply delayed. This is why avoidants can look like they moved on instantly while still carrying you somewhere inside them. It's not because they are heartless. It's because their system is built to postpone pain rather than process it. Now, why does understanding this stage matter for your viewers? Because stage 1 triggers the biggest mistake people make. They panic and re-enter the cycle. They see the avoidant fine, and they send another paragraph. They break no contact. They post something dramatic. They try to provoke jealousy. They try to get a reaction. They try to remind them of the bond. They chase, they collapse. And what happens when you do that? You remove the consequences of your giving up. You restore the old script. You give the avoidant emotional access again. And now their relief increases because they feel in control. They feel, see, they're still here. They feel, I can leave, and they'll chase. That's why stage 1 is so dangerous. Your nervous system is screaming for proof, and their nervous system is enjoying space. If you don't understand this difference, you will sabotage yourself. So let's name the stage properly: relief and deactivation. Deactivation means the avoidant is shutting down attachment feelings to protect themselves. It's like turning down the volume on emotion. They may focus on logic. They may rationalize. They may tell themselves stories. This is better. That wasn't right. I needed peace. Their mind becomes the manager and their heart goes offline for a while. And this is why you must not chase during stage 1. Chasing makes you look like pressure. Chasing becomes proof that closeness equals intensity. Chasing gives them a reason to stay away. Chasing blocks the internal collapse from ever beginning, because their system never has to feel the vacuum. If you keep reaching, there is no vacuum. If there is no vacuum, there is no consequence. If there is no consequence, there is no internal shift. Now here is what you do instead, and this is the key that keeps people watching. You become calm enough to let stage 1 pass without reacting. You stop looking for immediate regret as proof. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly they panic. You stop expecting them to process loss the way you do. You focus on one thing: maintaining your dignity and removing access. Because stage 1 is the calm before the internal storm. It's the nervous system exhale before the mind starts noticing what's missing. And if you stay steady, stage 1 becomes the doorway to the later stages. The shock, the access test, the vacuum, the shame, the regret. But if you break your boundary in stage 1, you never get there. You keep the cycle alive. Ladies and gentlemen, the deepest message of Keynote 1 is this: the avoidance relief is not proof you were unimportant. It is proof that you were close enough to trigger something they haven't healed. And the moment you stop chasing, you are no longer feeding their pattern. You are allowing reality to take over. Your job is not to force collapse. Your job is to stop rescuing them from consequences, and when you can hold that posture, when you can watch them look calm without panicking, you don't just trigger their later stages. You heal your own nervous system. You prove to yourself that your peace does not require their reaction. That is where real power begins. Ladies and gentlemen, the second keynote is where the avoidant becomes most dangerous. Not because they suddenly turn evil, but because their ego steps in to protect them from feeling the truth. After the relief stage, the avoidant often moves into narrative control. And narrative control is simply the story they tell themselves so they don't have to sit in regret, accountability, or vulnerability. Here is what happens internally. The moment they feel relief, their mind says, "Good, I escaped pressure." But relief alone doesn't fully settle the nervous system, because deep down they still know there was something real. So their brain does what humans do when we want to avoid emotional pain. It creates a narrative that justifies the decision. A narrative that makes them the reasonable one. A narrative that makes leaving feel like self-care instead of self-sabotage. This is why you will hear phrases that sting like knives. You were too much. You were needy. You were intense. That wasn't working. I needed peace. You're overthinking. I'm not ready. I'm focusing on myself. And ladies and gentlemen, sometimes these statements contain a tiny grain of truth, but they are not the full truth. They are a protective story. They are designed to reduce internal discomfort. Because if the avoidant admits, "I hurt someone who loved me," they have to face shame. If they admit, "I pushed away something healthy," they have to face regret. If they admit, "I'm afraid of intimacy," they have to face vulnerability. And vulnerability is what avoidance has been trying to escape their whole life. So the ego says, "No, let's rewrite this." This is why narrative control is such a critical stage for your viewers to understand, because most people react to the narrative instead of recognizing it. They hear, "You're too much," and they spiral. They start defending. They start explaining. They start proving. They start sending long messages trying to correct the record. "I'm not needy, I just care." "You're the one who disappears." "I only asked for the bare minimum." And while those defenses may be valid, engaging them at this stage is a trap. Because when you argue with an avoidance narrative, you are doing two things. First, you're giving them emotional access again. Second, you're providing them exactly what their nervous system associates with pressure, intensity, and emotional labor. They can then use your reaction as evidence that their story was right. "See, this is why I left." Your defense becomes their justification. And then you end up feeling even more powerless because you tried to speak truth, and it changed nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, narrative control is not about truth. It's about comfort. It's their mind trying to stay comfortable in the decision. It's their ego trying to avoid responsibility. And until the avoidant is ready to face themselves, the narrative will not change because you argued well. It changes only when reality becomes louder than the story. Now let's go deeper. Narrative control often has three purposes. One, it protects their self-image. They want to see themselves as good, reasonable, calm. So they paint you as emotional, demanding, complicated. If they can place the weight on you, they can avoid looking in the mirror. Two, it protects them from grief. If they admit you are valuable, they have to feel the loss. So they minimize you. They downplay the bond. They focus on your flaws. They remember the worst moments. They cling to anything that makes separation feel easier. Three, it protects their control. If they can label you as too much, they keep the upper hand. They stay in the position of the one who decides what's reasonable, and that control keeps them regulated. This is why you must not chase the narrative. You must not try to convince them you were enough. You must not try to win the argument, because the argument is not the point. The point is they are protecting themselves. So what do you do with narrative control? You refuse to participate. You stop debating your worth. You stop defending your needs. You stop offering more explanation to someone who already heard you and still chose distance. You stay calm and you go quiet. Not to punish, to protect. And here's the powerful part. When you stop reacting to the narrative loses fuel. Because narrative control depends on your participation. It depends on you chasing clarity, chasing fairness, chasing validation. The avoidant wants to leave and still feel right. But when you stop arguing, they are left alone with the story. And over time, especially when your emotional access disappears, reality starts poking holes in the narrative. They remember your patience. They remember your steadiness. They remember the times you showed up. They remember the warmth they took for granted. And then something unsettling happens. The story stops calming them. The story stops regulating them. The story stops working. That is when the internal collapse can begin. So the second keynote is a warning and a weapon. The warning is, don't take their narrative as objective truth. The weapon is, don't fight it. Don't chase it. Don't defend yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Let time and consequence do what your paragraphs never can. Ladies and gentlemen, the third keynote is the moment the avoidance internal world begins to crack. Not with dramatic tears, not with a sudden confession, but with a quiet, unsettling shock. This stage is called the first quiet shock, and it happens when the avoidant realizes the old script is gone. Because for a long time, the avoidant has lived inside a predictable system. They pull away and you reach. They go silent and you chase. They become cold and you try harder. They disappear and you panic. Even if they complain about it, even if they say they want space, part of them has depended on your reaction as proof that they still matter and as a safety net that keeps consequences low. So when you truly give up, not as a tactic, but as a decision, something unfamiliar happens. The predictable cycle breaks, and the avoidance nervous system notices. This is where the audience needs to listen closely, because the shock is not always visible. The avoidant might still look calm on the outside. They might still maintain their narrative. They might still distract themselves. But inside, a small alarm goes off. Wait, they didn't text. Wait, they didn't react. Wait, they didn't fight. Wait, they didn't show up the way they always do. And ladies and gentlemen, that moment is powerful because it does something their entire attachment strategy tries to avoid. It introduces uncertainty that they didn't choose. Avoidants are comfortable with distance when distance is under their control. They can leave. They can take space. They can return when they want. They can dip in and out. That control regulates them. But when you stop playing your part, control begins to slip, and loss begins to feel possible. Real loss. Not we're on a break loss. Not they'll be back loss. Real loss, the kind that can't be reversed with a casual message. Now this stage often shows up in small triggers. A weekend arrives and they realize you didn't check in. A holiday passes and your name doesn't appear. They post something and there's no reaction. They go quiet expecting you to chase and you don't. They assume you'll be there when they return, and they sense you might not be. And the reason it hits is because it challenges the avoidant's hidden belief, I can withdraw and still keep access. This is why the third keynote is not about your silence. It's about your absence being credible. Because many people go silent while still leaking attachment. They still watch stories. They still respond fast. They still post hints. They still ask mutual friends. They still accidentally reach out. That's not credible absence, that's a pause. An avoidance can feel a pause. They can wait out a pause. But credible absence is different. Credible absence has weight. It has finality. It has dignity. When you reach that point, the avoidant experiences what I call the quiet shock. The moment the nervous system says, this might be real. And that sensation produces internal tension. They might feel restless, irritated, curious. They might start thinking about you more. They might suddenly remember small details. They might replay the last conversation. They might wonder what you're doing. Not because they're suddenly transformed, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable for them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's where your audience gets hooked, because this stage often creates a strange contradiction. The avoidant may not reach out immediately. They might act like nothing happened. They might double down on distraction. They might intensify the narrative. Why? Because their ego wants to regain control. The ego does not like uncertainty. The ego does not like being the one who might be left. So they try to restore psychological power by pretending they don't care. But internally, the shift has already begun. Because once the old script breaks, the avoidant can't fully relax in their old strategy. Their nervous system is now dealing with a new question. What if my withdrawal cost me something permanent? That question is the beginning of collapse. This is why stage 3 is so important for you. It is the first stage where the avoidant starts feeling consequence. And consequence is what triggers real change, not your begging, not your explaining, not your pain. Consequence. Now, here's the danger. Most people sabotage stage 3 because they can't tolerate the silence. Their anxious system screams, do something, and they break. They send a text. They ask for closure. They post something dramatic. They re-enter the cycle. And the avoidance system relaxes again because control is restored. They're still there. The shock disappears. The collapse stops. So the third keynote demands a new kind of strength. You have to let them feel the missing piece without rushing to fill it. You have to let the quiet be loud. You have to let the consequence stand. You have to allow the uncertainty to do its work inside them. And ladies and gentlemen, here is the deepest truth in this keynote. The avoidance internal collapse begins the moment your absence becomes more believable than your attachment. The moment they sense you are no longer a guaranteed option. The moment the old cycle stops giving them comfort. That's when their mind starts to turn back toward you, not with a perfect plan, but with curiosity, restlessness, and the first cracks in the story. Stage 3 is the first crack. And if you stay dignified, that crack becomes the doorway to everything that follows. Ladies and gentlemen, the fourth keynote is the stage where the avoidant begins to move, not toward accountability yet, not toward full regret yet, but toward what I call access testing. This is where they reach out in small, low-risk ways to see if you're still available, because the quiet shock has rattled their sense of control. The old script broke. They expected you to chase, and you didn't. They expected you to react, and you stayed calm. Now uncertainty enters their system, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for avoidance. So what do? They test for access. Not always because they want to manipulate you, but because their nervous system wants a quick answer to one question. Do I still have them? Is the door still open? Can I restore the familiar dynamic without paying the emotional price of repair? This stage is one of the most important stages in the entire internal collapse process because it is the moment most people fail. Most people see the breadcrumb and think it means love. They see the message and think it means change. They see the story and think it means missing. And they collapse into full emotional access. They reopen the door wide. They give the avoidant exactly what their system was seeking: reassurance and control without vulnerability. And in that moment, the avoidant's internal collapse stops, because access restores regulation. Let's define what access testing looks like. It's not usually a long, heartfelt apology. It's casual. It's light. It's vague. It's a meme. Hope you're good. A random question that doesn't matter, a reaction to your story, a late night, thinking of you. It's contact that does not require them to face the real issue. It's contact that protects them from shame. It's contact that gives them an escape route if it doesn't go well. That's why it's called a test. They want to see if they can touch the connection without stepping into accountability. Now, ladies and gentlemen, why does this happen at stage 4? Because stage 3 created uncertainty. The avoidant sense that you might actually be gone. And when an avoidant feels the possibility of real loss, their system shifts. They still fear closeness, but now they also fear irreversibility. They fear that the door might close permanently, and instead of walking up and saying, "I'm sorry," which would require courage, they do the safest move: they test. This stage also happens because avoidants often struggle with direct vulnerability. They don't know how to say, "I miss you and I'm scared." They don't know how to say, "I didn't handle things well." Their nervous system interprets that kind of honesty as danger, so they disguise the reach out. They use casualness as armor. They act like nothing happened. They pretend they're just checking in. They keep it light so they can retreat if they feel exposed. And the tragic thing is that the person on the other side, you often reads that casualness as cruelty. How can they say hey after all that? But psychologically, it's often avoidance trying to reconnect without shame. Now, what's the right response? Here's the rule: never reward a test with a reunion. If you reward a breadcrumb with emotional flooding, you teach the avoidant that they can return without repair. You teach them that accountability is optional. You teach them that your boundary was temporary. You teach them that your giving up was just a mood. And the avoidance system relaxes because control returns. The uncertainty disappears. They get the benefit of your warmth without the discomfort of growth. That is why stage 4 is a discipline stage for you. It tests whether your giving up was real. It tests whether you have standards or just pain. It tests whether you're truly done participating in the old cycle. So your response must be warm but brief, kind but closed, calm but not intimate. Something like, "Good to hear from you. Hope you're well." And then you stop. No questions, no emotional essay, no reopening the relationship, no instant forgiveness. You leave space for them to show intention. And that pause is not cruelty. That pause is clarity. If they truly want to reconnect, they will step forward. They will ask for a real conversation. They will address the rupture. They will show effort. They will move beyond the breadcrumb. But if they only wanted to test access, they will fade. They will keep it shallow. They will disappear again. And that reveals the truth: they didn't come back to rebuild, they came back to regulate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is why stage 4 creates so much curiosity. Because your audience has seen this. They've lived this. They've experienced the random hey that reopened their hope. They've experienced the sudden like on a story that made their heart race. They've experienced the late night message that felt like destiny. And they've also experienced the crash afterward when the avoidant vanished again once the comfort returned. So stage 4 teaches a new identity. You are not a vending machine for comfort. You are not a reset button. You are not a safety net for someone who refuses accountability. You are a person with boundaries. And here is the deepest truth of stage 4: the breadcrumb is not the comeback. It's the knock on the door. And your job is not to throw the door open because someone knocked. Your job is to ask, "Why are you here?" And what are you willing to do differently? Because the avoidance internal collapse will only continue if access is not restored cheaply. If you hold the line, stage 4 moves into stage 5, the vacuum. But if you collapse and give access, the cycle resets, and the collapse never completes. So don't fear the breadcrumb. Respect it for what it is, a test. And pass the test by staying calm, brief, and dignified. Ladies and gentlemen, the 5th keynote is where the avoidance internal collapse becomes impossible to ignore, because this is the stage where the vacuum begins. And the vacuum is not silence on your phone. The vacuum is what happens inside them when your emotional access is no longer available, when their tests stop working, when their distractions stop numbing, and when their sense of control starts slipping. This stage only happens if you pass stage 4 correctly. If you reward the breadcrumb with a reunion, the vacuum never forms. The avoidant gets regulated again. They feel safe again. They regain control again, and the cycle resets. But if you respond warm but brief, and you don't reopen intimacy, you keep the door from swinging wide open. You keep access from being restored cheaply. And that's when the vacuum starts doing its work. Now, what does the vacuum feel like for an avoidant? It often shows up as restlessness before it shows up as missing. Avoidants don't always process loss as sadness. First, they process it as agitation, irritation, a feeling of being unsettled, a strange anxiety they can't name. They might feel bored with their distractions. They might feel low-level tension in their body. They might feel an urge to check their phone. They might feel the pull to look at your social media. They might start thinking about you more in random moments. And here's why their old regulation strategy is failing. Distance regulated them because it reduced pressure. But now distance is producing something else, uncertainty. And uncertainty is a type of pressure avoidants aren't good at holding. They preferred being the one who chose space. They preferred being the one who controlled the pace. They preferred knowing they could return anytime and reset everything. But in the vacuum stage, they start realizing, I might not be able to return the way I used to. They start sensing that you're not waiting, you're not begging, you're not reacting. You're not keeping the emotional bridge open. And when that bridge is gone, they face a new experience, absence that has weight. That is the vacuum. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is why distractions begin to fail in this stage. Work, friends, scrolling, entertainment, dating. These things can numb feelings for a while, but they don't fix attachment. They don't repair the bond. They don't restore access. They don't provide the specific emotional regulation you used to provide. Because you were not just a person. You were a pattern. You were familiarity. You were steadiness. You were a predictable emotional environment they could return to after withdrawing. So when you're gone for real, the mind starts replaying what it lost. Not because they're suddenly healthy, but because the nervous system is searching for what used to calm it. This is why the vacuum often leads to checking behavior. They might start watching your stories more. They might ask mutual friends about you. They might look at old pictures. They might reread messages. They might drive by places you used to go. They might even start feeling jealous, not because they suddenly became committed, but because they're confronting a new possibility. You are moving on and they are no longer in control. And this is where the internal collapse deepens, because the ego begins to lose its grip. Remember stage 2, narrative control. The story was, they were too much. I needed peace. I'm fine. But stage 5 creates emotional evidence that contradicts the story. If they were truly fine, why are they restless? If you were truly the problem, why do they keep checking? If leaving was truly peace, why does the silence feel heavy now? So the story starts cracking. Now I want you to hear something important, ladies and gentlemen. The vacuum stage is not always pretty. Avoidants don't always respond by becoming softer. Sometimes they respond by becoming more controlling. They might post more, they might show off. They might try to provoke you. They might date someone quickly. They might try to regain control through attention. They might send another breadcrumb. They might become inconsistent again. Because the vacuum makes them uncomfortable and they want to restore comfort. So this stage tests you again, will you bite? Because the vacuum is designed to pressure you too. Your nervous system will be tempted to interpret their checking as proof they miss you. Your heart will want to jump. Your mind will want to chase the meaning. But if you respond emotionally to every hint, you restore access again. And then the vacuum collapses. Their discomfort is relieved, and the cycle resets. This is why stage 5 is about maintaining your dignity under invisible pressure. You let the vacuum stay. You let them sit in the discomfort they created. You stop rescuing them from consequences with your availability. And you keep your life moving, not loudly, not performatively, but steadily. Because the vacuum is where the avoidant finally begins to feel the real cost of their pattern. Not the cost of losing the relationship label. The cost of losing your emotional home. And this is where people misunderstand the goal. The goal is not to make them suffer. The goal is to let reality teach what your pleading never could. Reality is a better teacher than your paragraphs. Consequence is a better teacher than your emotions. Silence, real silence, is a better teacher than your explanations. So in stage 5, the avoidant becomes restless because the old strategy is failing. They start checking. They start thinking. The narrative cracks. And if you hold the line, stage 5 leads to stage 6, shame and self-reflection. But if you collapse and restore access, stage 5 ends prematurely, and the avoidant never has to face themselves. That's why this keynote is so powerful. It teaches your audience that the vacuum isn't the end. It's the beginning of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, the 6th keynote is the stage most avoidants fear more than loneliness itself, because it is the moment the mirror turns toward them. This is the stage of shame and self-reflection. And I need you to hear this clearly. Shame is not always loud. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't always look like tears. Often it looks like avoidance intensifying. It looks like silence. It looks like irritability. It looks like sudden defensiveness. It looks like them pretending they don't care while thinking about you non-stop. Because shame is the emotion that says, I did something that doesn't match who I want to believe I am. Stage 6 arrives only when stage 5 has done its job. The vacuum has been sitting in their chest. The distractions have started failing. The story they told themselves has cracks. They can't fully convince themselves anymore that leaving was pure peace. They can't fully soothe themselves with the narrative that you were the problem. Something inside them has begun to whisper, what if I messed up? And that whisper is the beginning of collapse. Now, why is this stage so hard for avoidants? Because many avoidants were trained early in life to associate mistakes with punishment. They learned that vulnerability leads to criticism, rejection, or shame. They learned that being emotionally exposed is dangerous. So instead of processing shame and reflecting, they developed a survival skill: deactivate, detach, distract, deflect. That's why even when they feel guilt or regret, they often don't come forward cleanly. They avoid the conversation that would require humility. They avoid the accountability that would require exposure. But in stage 6, they can't fully avoid it anymore because the vacuum keeps bringing them back to the truth. The truth is simple. Your absence is real. Your emotional access is gone. And the consequences are not just theoretical anymore. They can't casually reach for you and instantly feel comfort. They can't dip in and out without cost. They can't soothe themselves with your quick warmth. They have to sit with what they did and what it cost them. That's why stage 6 feels like internal pressure. It's the moment the ego starts losing its grip. The ego wants to say, they were too much. But the heart remembers your patience. The ego wants to say, I needed peace. But the body feels restless without you. The ego wants to say, I'm fine. But their behavior, checking, thinking, testing, contradicts that story. And when the ego can't maintain the story, the mirror appears. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about how shame shows up in avoidance, because it's rarely direct. Some avoidants become self-critical in private. They replay moments. They remember your face. They remember your voice. They remember the last time you tried to explain your pain. And they feel a heavy awareness. I hurt them. But instead of reaching out with humility, they freeze. Because humility feels like risk. It feels like the moment they might be rejected. It feels like the moment they might have to admit they were wrong. And for a nervous system that equates wrong with danger, that's terrifying. Other avoidants respond differently. They externalize shame. They get angry. They judge you. They blame. They say, you moved on too fast. They accuse you of being cold. They try to provoke you. They try to pull you into conflict. Conflict gives them something familiar to hold. Conflict keeps them from feeling the deeper emotion underneath. If they can make you the villain, they can avoid facing their own reflection. So in stage 6, you might see mixed signals. They might reach out and then disappear. They might be sweet and then distant. They might test you more. They might send a stronger breadcrumb. They might even say something emotional and then retreat. Because they are hovering near accountability, but their system is still fighting exposure. This is why your response in stage 6 is critical. Many people, when they sense the avoidant is cracking, rush in to rescue them emotionally. They give reassurance. They say, it's okay. They soften everything. They try to make it easy for the avoidant to return. And that seems kind, but it can also be self-betrayal if it removes the consequence that created reflection in the first place. Because stage 6 is where real change becomes possible, but only if the avoidant is allowed to sit in the discomfort long enough to choose growth. So your job is not to punish them. Your job is not to soothe them prematurely. Your job is to stay calm, clear, and anchored in standards. If they reach out, you can be warm, but you don't erase the past. If they hint at regret, you don't rush back into intimacy. You hold the line consistency and repair. You require accountability to come with action. Because shame without action becomes another loop. They feel bad, they avoid, they soothe themselves with a breadcrumb, they get access, then they withdraw again. That's the cycle. But shame with action becomes transformation. Shame becomes humility. Humility becomes repair. Repair becomes consistency. Consistency becomes trust. So stage 6 is the crossing point. It's the moment they are forced to face themselves. Some avoidants will choose growth. They will reach out more directly. They will acknowledge what happened. They will apologize cleanly. They will ask to rebuild. Others will run because facing themselves is too painful. And if they run, you must not chase, because chasing rescues them from the very mirror they needed. Ladies and gentlemen, stage 6 is the moment you stop being an emotional home for someone who won't do the work. You let the mirror stay in front of them, and you stay rooted in your worth. Because whether they choose growth or escape, you are no longer available for love that requires you to abandon yourself. Because in avoidant psychology, the story only holds until the silence becomes real. And when the silence becomes real, the ego can't fully protect them anymore. That's when the next stages begin.